According to the New York Times, Biden could roll back Trump agenda with blitz of executive actions. For Joseph R. Biden Jr., who won the election in a deeply divided nation, the early signals he sends as the country's new leader will be critical. President-elect Joseph Biden Jr. is poised to unleash a series of executive actions on his first day in the Oval Office, prompting what is likely to be a years-long effort to unwind President Trump's domestic agenda and immediately signal wholesale shift in the United States' place in the world. In the first hours after he takes the oath of office on the west front of the Capitol at noon on January 20th, Mr. Biden has said he will send a letter to the United Nations indicating that the country will rejoin the global effort to combat climate change, reversing Mr. Trump's decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord with more than 174 countries. Just when we start to get into it, we're going to look at an article written for the Americans for Tax Reform, written by Justin Sykes. And this article is from 2017. This is just around the time when President Trump was getting us out of the Paris Climate Accord, Paris Climate Agreement. And in this article, Justin Sykes breaks down some of the core issues surrounding the Paris Climate Accord and why President Trump wanted to get us out of it. Through a litany of regulations stemming from the agreement, Obama essentially offered up the U.S. economy as a sacrificial lamb to further his own legacy. The agreement, however, would not have just hurt the country's growth as a whole, but would have trickled down to low and middle income Americans. If the U.S.'s participation in the agreement had been allowed to move forward, energy costs would have skyrocketed, in turn raising the cost of utility bills for families and increasing the cost of consumer goods. A recent study by the Heritage Foundation projected that the Paris Agreement and resulting policies would have increased electricity costs for a family of four between 13 and 20% annually. The study also projected American families would see over $20,000 of income lost by the year 2035. Such regressive policy hits the nation's most vulnerable hardest, who ironically are the same people Obama used to justify the deal. The Paris debacle was also slated to reduce the U.S. GDP by over $2.5 trillion and result in an average shortfall of nearly 400,000 jobs by 2035. Of the 400,000 jobs lost, an estimated 200,000 would have been in the manufacturing sector, meaning Americans would have seen the cost of consumer goods such as electronics, paper products, and apparel increase, inevitably taking more out of their household income. With such drastic costs to the U.S., Americans would expect an equally drastic benefit on the other end. Yet that's simply not the case. Policies such as those resulting from the climate deal would, even with a complete elimination of the U.S. carbon emissions, result in less than 0.2 of a degree Celsius reduction in the global temperature. But that's debatable because we have no control over these other countries. And if you get into the Paris Climate Agreement, you start to realize that countries like China, which is one of the most powerful economies in the world, is considered a developing nation and gets leeway, gets a free pass. They're allowed to continue developing non-green, non-renewable energy sources and keep pushing these fossil fuels and keep expanding their industrial complex without being hindered by the Paris Climate Accord until much later than the United States. Now I realize that these NDCs, or nationally determined contributions that each country sets, are set by themselves, and there's not really an obligation to meet them but that's current. That's as it's set right now. That could change. The big thing here, though, is that we're being held to a different standard. So regardless of whether or not we truly cripple our economy for the purpose of not seeing a temperature increase globally, it remains unknown because these different countries we really don't have a say over, especially countries like China. It's not like a country that we can just go over there and say, nope, you're going to do it this way or else, because China's a very powerful country. They have they have a booming economy. They have billions of people ready to work or being forced to work. Depends how you look at it. So whether or not we could impact the global temperature rise by reducing our emissions only remains to be seen. But let's get back into it. It is all too clear the Paris climate deal was all cost and no benefit for the United States. And unlike the Obama administration, which was all too comfortable sacrificing low and middle income Americans, along with thousands of jobs and GDP, President Trump realized Paris was a bad deal, quote, bad deal, for America and its citizens, and made the right decision to withdraw from this disastrous agreement. So one thing I mentioned was the nationally disclosed contributions, the NDCs. That is the forecast or projection of declining emissions that each country that's in the Paris Climate Accord sets for themselves. There's no obligation to meet them. There's no penalty if they don't meet them, at least currently at this time. But each country is supposed to set their NDCs and then reevaluate and provide reports on them every 5 years, I believe, and then set another NDC from that point. Countries like ours, the United States, and countries like China use 2005 as their benchmark, which they measured against, referring to their emissions and if they were decreasing or increasing, and then they show them as they trend from 2005, using that as their benchmark. But NDCs are not obligatory. It's just like making a pinky promise, saying, we pinky promise that we're going to reduce our emissions to, by X percentage by year 2025, which I believe the United States, Obama promised to reduce our emissions by 26 to 28% by the year 2025. That's a bold claim. We have a powerful economy, and it's been growing actually under Trump. And to make that statement and claim that we're going to reduce our emissions while growing without hindering the economy, I don't know how you can make that statement and believe it to be true and think that you're going to be able to hold the entire country to that. Now, China is set to reduce their emissions by 2030. I believe their percentage is a lot lower. However, their CO2 emissions as a whole are almost double the United States. So their percentage could be lower and still equal a greater reduction in CO2 emissions. But the difference is they're being given a pass and being allowed to continue to develop at an exponential rate using fossil fuels and other non-renewable, non-green energy sources, while other countries like our own are being hindered. Now, we're being hindered by ourselves if we enter this agreement and hold ourselves to it, because like I said, these are not obligations that have penalties. The big cost to this, or the big penalty, is if you're a country that is a part of the Paris Climate Agreement, and let's say you don't meet your NDCs, you don't meet the projections that you've given, there's a potential monetary penalty, but it's not going to be levied in such a way that you're being told that you're being penalized. Essentially, you just wouldn't have access to the funding that's being garnered by the Green Climate Fund through the UN, or the let's pull it up, through the UN or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So there's no penalty assessed in that, aside from global emissions rising, possibly leading to a temperature increase, possibly leading to other types of decay or deterioration of our environment. Who knows? But, as I said, China's not being held to the same standard as the United States. Now, when President Trump took us out of this agreement, he made a statement to the American public in June of 2017. So it really wasn't even that long ago. But President Trump, you can find his statements on whitehouse.gov. The name of the article is Statement by President Trump on the Paris Climate Accord. As president, I can put no other consideration before the well-being of American citizens. The Paris Climate Accord is simply the latest example of Washington entering into an agreement that disadvantages the United States to the exclusive benefit of other countries, leaving American workers, who I love, and taxpayers to absorb the cost in terms of lost jobs, lower wages, shuttered factories, and vastly diminished economic production. Thus, as of today, the United States will cease all implementation of the non-binding Paris Accord and the draconian financial and economic burdens the agreement imposes on our country. This includes ending the implementation of the Nationally Determined Contribution, NDC, and very importantly, the Green Climate Fund, which is costing the United States a vast fortune. It's several $billion. In the grand scheme of things in the American budget, several $billion really isn't, it's a drop in the bucket. But if you're a taxpayer and you're someone who's, paycheck to paycheck, if you're paying attention to where your money's going, and then you start to consider that this money is going to some green climate fund that's run by the UN, and we have no real say in where the money goes from that point, or who gets it, or how it's used, and how it benefits the American people, you might start to get pissed off and say, I'd rather keep that money. Now, you break down several $1 billion, you break that down over our population of taxpayers, it's really not that much money per person. But still, it's in principle that we don't want our money being used for crap that we don't have a say in. That's just not the way it works. Anyways, getting back to it. Compliance with the terms of the Paris Accord and the erroneous energy restrictions that it has placed on the United States could cost Americans as much as 2.7 million jobs by 2025, according to the National Economic Research Associates. This includes 440,000 fewer manufacturing jobs. Not what we need. Believe me, this is not what we need, including automobile jobs and the further decimation of vital American industries on which countless communities rely. They rely for so much, and we would be giving them so little. According to the same study, by 2040, compliance with the commitments put in place by the previous administration would cut production for the following sectors. Paper would be down 12%, cement down 23%, iron and steel down 38%, coal, and I happen to love the coal miners, would be down 86%, natural gas would be down 31%. Now this is a sidebar by me. Natural gas, it has been beneficial, and I'll show you later. Natural gas has been beneficial to reducing our emissions, our CO2 emissions. So losing massive jobs, or amounts of jobs in the natural gas sector would be bad for us. One, it makes us more reliant on other sources for energy. But two, natural gas is one of our more environmentally friendly energy sources with regards to CO2 emissions. Now, I know you could fight me on fracking or how that has a negative impact on the earth, but when we're talking strictly about emissions, CO2 emissions, natural gas is one of our better sources. The cost to the economy at this time would be close to $3 trillion in lost GDP and 6.5 million industrial jobs, while households would have $7,000 less income, and in many cases, much worse than that. So I don't need to go further into this because you already see how bad it is. And President Trump is referring to the National Economic Research Associates when he makes these claims. So for the people that think that Trump is dumb, which I don't believe he is, I just don't think he's the most well-spoken person that we've ever had as president. He's referring to research when he makes these claims. And he's also making references from his perspective as a experienced and successful businessman. And you could make claims, oh no, he's filed 6 bankruptcies. His brand or his company and its subsidiaries own like 500 something companies. So you're talking 6 of those companies have filed bankruptcy in the last like 30 years. And he's still a multi-billionaire. I would say he knows what he's doing in business. I'd say he used the system that our representatives had set up to benefit himself and make money, and then use the bankruptcy policies to claim these losses in a way that they weren't detrimental to the overall gains of his empire, if you will. So he does a good job of breaking this down and explaining why this is going to be bad, this being the Paris Climate Accord, why it is bad. And at that time, we were still in it. And then he explains why we're pulling out of it because of how terrible it's going to be, or was. That's why it's scary that if Biden gets elected, he's going to put this crap back in place. So, right, now, this is bad timing, right? So Trump got the economy back in high gear. It was booming. We had jobs created in every sector. We had the lowest unemployment rates for every demographic in history. In most demographics, it was the lowest in history. We had wage increases for different minority groups that hadn't been seen historically. We had, incentivized zones that were helping impoverished communities to build their own businesses and get past obstacles and have a more streamlined means of gaining funds so that they could build their businesses and become successful and create other jobs and stimulate the economy on that side as well. So this comes at a really bad time because then coronavirus hit. And we've shut down our country for almost a whole damn year. We have small businesses that are crippled. We have industries that have been essentially shut down. Many businesses are never coming back. And now, if the president becomes Joe Biden, he aims to get us back into this bad deal. While our economy is down from coronavirus, he wants to then start shipping our jobs back overseas. And I don't mean literally shipping our jobs back overseas, but by putting us back down into neutral and taking us out of drive because he doesn't want to increase any potential emissions, and then sending those jobs away because we're not allowing these industries to produce the way that they were, is going to cripple many Americans. Many families are going to be financially crippled by this. So one thing I mentioned is that the Paris Agreement Does the president even have the authority to enact the Paris Agreement and enter our country into this? And the Heritage Foundation brings up some good points. So in the Heritage Foundation, they wrote an article in 2016. The Paris Agreement is a treaty and should be submitted to the Senate. It shouldn't be something that the president gets to act as an executive action, executive order that enters our country into something that should be treated as a treaty. The Obama administration's unilateral treatment of the Paris Agreement is particularly disquieting for two reasons. The agreement has all the hallmarks of a treaty that should be submitted to the Senate for its advice and consent under Article 2, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution. And two, the agreement contains targets and timetables for emission reductions. And as such, the administration's failure to submit the agreement to the Senate breaches a commitment made by the executive branch to the Senate in 1992 during the ratification process of the UNFCCC. Now, the UNFCCC is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, for those of you that are wondering. So there's that. It should have gone through the Senate. It should have been evaluated by our other elected representatives, our other branches of government, before being implemented. So it's a good thing that Trump got us out of it. It's a bad thing that Biden wants to get us back into it. We're going to see. But here's the funny thing. We don't need to be in the Paris Climate Accord to fix our emissions. Now, there's an article on Inside Climate News. And this article is written by Nicholas Kuznets. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. U.S. emissions dropped in 2019. Here's why. That's the name of the article. But it goes on to show, right here, I'll put the charts up. It goes on to show the decline in emissions since 2005 to 2019, at the time when this was written. It shows that our net greenhouse gas emissions relative to our international commitments has decreased by thousands of metric tons per annual metric tons. It also shows that while in the media they push that Trump is this guy that is all for coal. He loves coal and he's pushing for coal and he wants to grow our coal industry for production of energy. Now, he hasn't been hindering the growth of the coal industry. Well, what's interesting to see is if you look right here, we've actually been reducing our coal reliance. And you can watch, and it's continued to trend down under Trump, while natural gas, or gas, the resource that we use for energy, has continued to spike. But another thing that people think when they're having a thought about Trump is they think he's against renewable energy and green energy. But if you look at this chart, you'll see that our renewables and our reliance on renewable energy sources and our use of renewable energy sources has continued to rise under Trump, and actually had a spike at the beginning of Trump's presidency, and another spike, or not really a spike, but another increasing slope from 2018 to currently. So he's not this fossil fuel, he's not this proponent for fossil fuel that hates renewables and wants to destroy the economy or destroy the environment. No, he's using what works while also implementing the newer, greener energies in the background. Our country is massive. Our economy is booming. We need energy sources that can be relied upon. And as of right now, for the consumption of electricity and energy that we use, renewables aren't there yet. But that doesn't mean we should give up on them, and Trump hasn't. He's been continuing to grow renewables while growing the gas industry, while the coal industry has been in decline. So we're doing all the right things without being in the Paris Climate Agreement. We're reducing our emissions. We're improving our renewables. We're decreasing our reliance on coal. So we're taking all the appropriate steps. Why do we need to go back to the Paris Climate Agreement, start funneling money to the Green Climate Fund and the UN, taking it out of the American taxpayers' pocket, when we're already accomplishing our goals without being a part of this? Why don't we just keep doing what we're doing without stealing more money from Americans? China's rising emissions prove Trump right on the Paris Agreement. In this article, it says, just last week, an analysis from Greenpeace indicated that China's 2018 carbon emissions were on track to grow at the fastest rate in 6 years. Right at the same time that everyone's criticizing President Trump for getting us out of the Paris Climate Agreement, or the commitment, non-binding commitment that we were in, during the same period of time, China's emissions are growing drastically. So they're not being held to the same standard anyway. They're continuing to push forward with just spilling out CO2 emissions to grow their economy. They're not willing to sacrifice the growth of their economy to reduce their CO2 emissions. The study, based on government data regarding the use of coal and other energy sources, shows carbon output rising 4% in the first quarter of this year. Analysts are projecting similar gains over the next several quarters. The weakness in the Paris Agreement is that it was lopsided, requiring little from China and a great deal from the United States. President Obama committed the United States to reducing carbon emissions in 2025 by 26 to 28%. And I'll pull this up right here, right there. Which would have meant a substantial jump in electricity costs, which that was already covered. We already see it. But this is being covered by the Hill. It's no secret that the Paris Climate Agreement, the Paris Climate Accord, would have a negative impact on all Americans, especially low and middle income earners, because your electricity costs are going to go up. Jobs and job creation will stagnate. Jobs will start to dry up, leaving less potential for earning income through those means. It's just not good for us. As vague as its goals were, it is becoming clear that the country is unlikely to meet them. To do so would require sacrificing growth to rein in pollution. Since the Chinese Communist Party has pledged to double China's 2010 GDP by 2020 and to create a moderately prosperous society by 2021, that is extremely unlikely. So they're not even attempting to reduce their emissions. Fans of the Paris Climate Accord have proudly noted that China's emissions flattened between 2014 and 2016, but that reported hiatus in Beijing's long-term carbon growth occurred during a period of economic deceleration. In 2017, with a renewed push for industrial investment and output, emissions again began to grow. China is key. It is by far the world's biggest source of carbon emissions, producing more than 1/4 of the global total and 81% more than the United States. The US is the second largest and India a distant third. Unlike China, emissions from the United States have trended lower in recent years. The peak occurred in 2005. Overall net emissions in 2016 were 12.1% lower than in 2005. And the International Energy Agency reports another drop in 2017. And you see in these charts that I've already shown you, I'll put them back up, that they're continuing to drop. The United States has also implemented higher fuel economy standards for automobiles, but the impact from that measure has been far more limited. Emissions in the electric power sector dropped 25% between 2005 and 2016. From 2,401 million metric tons to 1,809 million metric tons. In transportation, the decline was more modest, 4%. Increased use of renewables for power generation was a key contributor in the decline of U.S. emissions. You see that? Renewables under President Trump, the guy that everyone thinks is against renewables and green energy and considers him to be the fossil fuel guy. By contrast, in China, coal has trended higher recently, driving emissions up. Coal consumption, according to Beijing's own statistics, rose 0.4% in 2017, producing some backpedaling among those optimistic about China's compliance with the Paris Accord. Others estimate the increase is actually between 1% and 5% because they're skeptical of China's own statistics. It is difficult to know, given China's history of fudging the numbers. In the lead up to the Paris talks, for instance, it became obvious that China was burning 17% more coal than it had admitted, a variance the New York Times described as immense. So the big thing to take out of this is that the Paris Climate Accord and the UN and the Green Climate Fund, it's this globalist commitment. And even though it's non-binding, it's not necessarily the commitments and any potential penalty that is the issue. The issue really should be looked at from the point of the American taxpayer and how this will impact them. They're going to lose money in their taxes because we're going to be funneling billions of dollars to the Green Climate Fund. They're going to lose money in income because of the cost of, or they're going to lose money in income because of increased costs for energy use, increased costs for consumer goods, increased costs for things like fuel, because there's going to be more restrictions and more regulations on those, driving the cost up. And lastly, and I think most importantly, it's going to reduce jobs in the United States, leaving less potential options for earning an income and providing for your family. So you're losing jobs, you're losing money, and then at the same time, the government is sending money to some sort of globalist organization that's meant to save the planet. But we don't know how they're going to really use the money, who's going to get the money, and how we track the money. to see if it's being used appropriately. We've seen in recent months that elected officials and large corporations are willing to do just about anything and act immorally and unethically so that they can pocket more money at the expense of you and I, or you and me. So just keep that in mind. Hopefully we don't enter the Paris Climate Accord again, but it's looking like we might. It all depends on what the outcome of this election is that we're still waiting on. So stay safe, take care of your family, hug a loved one, and just, keep going to work every day, and we'll see what happens. I'm Alex with LWS. You have a good day.